In his recent book, Politics on the Edge, former Minister Rory Stewart wrote about a specific incident between him and the civil servants who were there to support him, and it left me completely shocked. So here's how it's supposed to work. The ministers of government are elected to be in charge of the policy and practice of the government. They make the decisions. Not necessarily every operational decision, for sure. In the UK, they are supported by a permanent civil service whose members are expected to be impartial, in other words, to serve whichever government is in power, regardless of their own personal political preferences. Somewhat different to the US system, where large numbers of people come into the administration of government as political appointees of a new president. We could argue about which is better, but of course US politics is far more riven with controversy over the so-called deep state, people who don't necessarily change, than is the UK, which has more of those people, the UK civil service. While they might have to cope with frequent changes in the person sitting in the ministerial seat, they might therefore have to go to great lengths to bring them up to speed with the detail of their departmental brief. Ultimately, it's their job to get done what the government wants done. Now, of course, human beings being what they are and small p politics being a constant in any workplace, it's never going to be that simple, and that's probably been true since the civil service first came into being. It's probably been true even when it's been working at its best. The series Yes Minister famously illustrated the sort of tricks that wily civil servants could use to, in their view, protect ministers from themselves, or at the very least protect the civil servants from the consequences of their decisions.
If you want to be really sure that the minister doesn't accept it, you must say the decision is courageous.
And that's worse than controversial.
But while I would always assume that there would often be ministers who might be naive about how to actually get things done in practice, I did presume the system broadly works as described. Broadly. Enter Rory Stewart. Now, for those of you who don't know, Rory is a political commentator, co-host of the Rest is Politics podcast, the sort of politician a floating voter like me would appreciate. Reasonable, firmly anchored in the centre ground, open to good people and ideas across the political divide, also a very good writer. I certainly recommend his book, which is about his foray into elected politics and his entry into the previous Conservative government. After a period on the backbenches, then as a junior minister in the Environment Department, Rory became Minister in the Department for International Development, DFID. The UK has long been well known for the generosity of its foreign aid programmes. Indeed, during the government of David Cameron, Britain did what had long been promised, but had never been achieved, which was to increase its spending to 0.7% of GDP, which is a figure set by the United Nations as a target for rich countries for their foreign aid. The trouble with a big commitment like that, which is attached to the size of a budget rather than a specific outcome, is that it can become the job of people further down the line just to shovel the money out the door without a huge amount of care and attention. Now, the UK aid operation wasn't supposed to be that at all. It was the Rolls-Royce of aid operations, with a focus on quality of outcomes, value for money, and all of that. Rory Stewart was a good minister to test some of those assumptions because he'd spent a lot of time heading up an NGO on the ground in Afghanistan, had been heavily involved in a number of the world's most troubled places. So, significantly more relevant history than most of those who ended up sitting in that seat. So let's tell the story from his book, because this background came to serve him on one occasion in particular. 3 officials gave him the paperwork for a proposed project. This is largely a formality, Minister, the leader said. It is about providing support to Syria. The implication I'm reading in that is that it was expected the minister would just rubber stamp it. But instead, having flicked through the paperwork, Rory asked, "Are these not the enclaves controlled by the jihadi factions?" Which you would think was a rather important question. The response, "I think, Minister, that there are many different groups in this area." "So we are not funding jihadis?" he asked. "No, Minister," reportedly stated with absolute confidence. "How do we know?" he pushed. "We have due diligence and monitoring and evaluation teams in every context, Minister." Pushing further, he established that they had no people on the ground, and he described to them what he had seen in similar places in the past. "I described the municipal councils I had seen taken over by jihadi groups in southern Iraq, the windowless buildings pockmarked with shrapnel, and the exhausted civil servants cowed by swaggering militia in black clothes with Kalashnikovs bound tight to their chests." The upshot of conversation was he told them he was vetoing the programme. Now the next day, a more senior group of civil servants came to see him. They told him it actually wasn't in his power to veto the programme, which you and I might agree with Rory Stewart seems a bit strange. If his signature was required to approve a programme, you would presume that the withholding of that signature would mean that it was not approved. He was told, "The decision is above our pay grades, Minister." But then none of them were able to tell him whose decision it actually was. Now, already at this point, my jaw is dropping. But that's nothing compared with what comes next. So on further investigation, Rory picked up hints that the decision really rested with the British Syrian embassy, which was in exile in Turkey. Well, he flew to Turkey, didn't just phone them, he flew to Turkey to meet with them in person. The ambassador there admitted that he favours the decision, but denied that he ultimately controls it, and he pointed to a US Special Forces Command instead. I'm not personally sure how a US Special Forces Command can have decision-making powers for British aid, but fine, let's go with it. It took calls to 3 generals to get agreement for a meeting with a liaison officer with the US forces. In that meeting, he said the decision had nothing to do with them. The Foreign Office Director and senior security officials, the senior civil servant officials responsible for Syria, also denied responsibility. They implied that the decision rested with Brett McGurk, the US presidential envoy for Iraq and Syria. Well, it turns out that Rory knew Brett McGurk from his time in Iraq, so he flew to Washington, D.C. to meet him in person. Brett said that the US had no idea what was happening in the Northwest, and it was very likely the jihadis were profiting from our money, and implied that I was probably wise to close the programme. Does this sound like a farce yet? I mean, they would have rejected this as a script for Yes Minister because it would have been considered as too ridiculous, too unrealistic. But we're not finished yet. Next, he was told that the policy emanated from a small group of senior civil servants in London, but he wasn't allowed to attend that group because it was officials only, which, how is that even a thing? So he got the attendance list, and then he went to see every one of the group attendees individually. Then he took his case to the ministers responsible for national security, to whom that group reported. Those ministers professed themselves to be bewildered to learn that they had made a policy decision about funding jihadi-controlled councils in Syria, and said that they were happy to go with Rory Stewart's judgment. But still, the money kept flowing to the municipal councils. Finally, perhaps 3 months into my campaign, officials told me that only the PM, the Prime Minister, could stop the funding flow. Well, at last, you might be thinking. At least if that's the case, then Rory can drop a note to the PM and it will finally get sorted out. I mean, should be how it works, shouldn't it? Should be easy, shouldn't it? He's in the government. I asked my DFID private office to draft a letter explaining my concern to the Prime Minister. The draft they produced didn't challenge the policy, presumably because some official had told them not to convey my message. So I rewrote it. They then took it to lightly edit. This edit again removed my argument. I mean, if Franz Kafka had been a minister, it couldn't have been worse than this. So I wrote my own letter and booked a meeting with the Prime Minister's Foreign Affairs advisor. But it turned out that said advisor was actually pretty close with the civil servants in Rory's own department, or wherever they needed to be. He was asked to pass the letter on to the Prime Minister. Then, over the next couple of months, there was no confirmation that it had ever reached him. And here is the astonishing punchline. After all that, 4 months after the letter had attemptedly been delivered to the Prime Minister, the Director for the Middle East came into Rory's office and said, "I'm afraid I'm here to brief you on a problem, Minister. It appears that one of the individuals whom we fund in northwest Syria has been videoed on a stage at an event organised and sponsored by Al-Qaeda. We have prepared press lines, but our advice, Minister, would be to terminate the funding for this kind of project in Syria." And somehow, he writes, the funding then just ceased. What on earth are we supposed to make of that? Who really decided that this funding should be provided and then determinedly fought back against its cancellation behind the scenes? How can we believe that ministers actually make a difference when the department, apparently in unison because no one broke ranks, simply operated to frustrate and stymie entirely legitimate ministerial commands? I'm aware that many decisions in government do not get frustrated in this way. If that was the norm, we would see a lot more political backlash against it than we do see. But at the same time, this is an extraordinary case study. I mean, my money being sent by my government to support jihadis in Syria, no accountability, no oversight, nothing. It damages your trust in the people who claim that the British aid operation is well managed, focused on best practice and measurable outcomes. And it reinforces the impression that so much of the money that does go in is being wasted at best. Of course, no large operation is 100% efficient. Of course, mistakes will be made. But this experience of Rory Stewart's just really shook my understanding and my faith of how the machinery of government is at least supposed to work. So I'm still reading Rory's book, but will wholeheartedly recommend it as a fascinating insight into a rather remarkable moment in UK political history.